More than 30 years ago, a severe ice storm struck the Southeast. That real-life event in 1994 is the springboard for a collection of stories about a fictional town in Mississippi hit by the storm. Robert Busby, a Mississippi native who now lives in Memphis, is the author of Bodock Stories, published by Hub City Press. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ray. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Tell us more about growing up in the hill country of North Mississippi and how that informs this work.
I grew up in a small town. It's called Bodock, Mississippi. So it was in between Tupelo and Oxford would be the two most conspicuous, famous landmarks there. The town in the story collection, Bodock, it's based off of my hometown of Bodock. I don't want to say all of the experiences in the book come from my childhood because that would sound like a very disturbing childhood. A lot of it's from my imagination. So maybe it's just my imagination that's more disturbing than my actual upbringing. But a lot of those experiences and a lot of the stories I was told definitely informed this collection. I started out, I didn't know that I was going to write an entire collection about an ice storm, but I did know that I wanted to write a collection in the vein of so many Mississippi writers. Faulkner, obviously, but Lewis Norton, Jesmyn Ward, Ace Atkins, just a plethora of writers who have used their home base, their stamp, to inform their fiction, the stories that they tell. And so that's how we got to Bodock.
And these stories flow from after the ice storm, but they also jump back in time. They jump around with time. They play with time.
That's correct. There's one story in the collection that takes place. It's Bodock 1816 to 1834 that just tells sort of the origin story of the founding of Bodock and the fictional county Clay Gardner, which is a surname that the founders sort of took up to sort of. Actually, it came from, I guess, y'all's part of the state in the story, migrated across what would be the Natchez Trace, down to Mississippi and took up a new last name and started a sort of settlement there. And then, there's another story that takes place in a sort of Bodock purgatory, I guess, called 20 Mile that plays around with time as well and takes some of those characters that were introduced in the 1800s and in that origin story and the founding of Bodock and sort of follows them in a very condensed way across the next century and a half to where they are in this afterlife of Clay Gardner County.
And though this is informed by your experience growing up in North Mississippi, as you said, this is not an autobiography or a roman à clef. So then when it comes to how did you name the town? How did you name other places in this universe built around this town and names of characters? How did you arrive at that? How was that trial and error?
Well, I'll start with Clay Gardner County. I don't know, that name just kind of popped into my head. Clay Gardner, we have North Mississippi, and a lot of places in the South are known for the red clay that persists beneath the topsoil, I guess. And someone who's farming there, the name Clay Gardner just sounded like that could be a county in Mississippi. But Bodock has a lot more intentional reasoning, I guess, behind calling it that. So I get this question a lot, what is Bodock or what is a Bodock? And it's type of tree. It's basically the Osage orange tree. And Bodock is a colloquial pronunciation of what the French called this tree, which was, I'm going to butcher this because I don't speak French, despite somehow being voted vice president of the French club when I was a senior in high school in Bodock, Mississippi. But so the French called it Bodock, which means wood of the bow. And so the Osage and other indigenous tribes use this wood to frame their archery bows. Obviously, the French didn't have much use for the wood in that respect. So that name, that pronunciation, Bodock, eventually became Bodark. I've seen that spelling and that pronunciation as well, but we in Mississippi, or at least in North Mississippi, always heard it called Bodock. My hometown, Bodock, used to be the home of the largest Bodock tree in the state of Mississippi. That was until 2001 when another February weather event, but this time was a tornado, which speaks to just how peculiar weather systems can get in this part of the country. But the tornado in 2001 failed the tree, and so it no longer stands. But there had been a Bodock festival in Pontotoc before then, and it continues after. So Bodock is part of the mythology of Pontotoc, Mississippi, but it also like there's a mythology to it with my family as well. Like my dad's parents, my paternal grandparents. I remember a Bodock tree in their backyard, and it was always there. I remember the horse apples, which could probably give you a concussion if they like landed on your head from a high enough height. But I would just like hear them like crash down on their roof, and they raised a lot of animals. They had like different chicken coops and bird coops and stuff like that in the backyard. So like those horse apples would just bounce off of the aluminum roofing and stuff like that. And just sound, so all of those things, just sort of those memories I could easily recall as and inspired these stories and just the imagery in the stories as well.
Nature seems to be its own character throughout these stories. Just listening to you the past few minutes, whether we're talking about the cataclysmic event through these stories, the ice storm, the roots of the name of the town.
That's accurate, I think. Like I said, I didn't set out to start to write an entire collection on this 1994 Mid-South ice storm. I was in childhood. I was a kid, maybe almost 10 years old when the ice storm happened. I had one story, the very last story in the collection was intended just to be a standalone ice storm story. But after I wrote that story, I wrote another story and then another story. And then suddenly, like, I sort of had like half of a collection of ice storm stories. And what I found out as I was writing these is that ice storm, there was such rich imagery to mine from this ice storm and finding out like different ways to describe this ice storm and its impact on the landscape. The trees, I remember some trees being split in half almost if they've been like struck by lightning just from the ice that had like seeped into the grooves of the tree or the precipitation rather. And then when it expanded, just basically exploded the tree. I remember more flexible like softwoods or like pine trees were just like bent over like catapults, and just even the sounds like ubiquitous, like it almost sounded like gunshots, definitely sounded like gunshots and other like sort of large, loud reports, sharp reports like in the surrounding woods. But then also like growing up in a rural town anywhere in the South or probably like across America. I mean, like nature is right outside your front door. It's something that I miss. I loved living in Memphis, but it's definitely something I miss, like living in a sort of rural landscape where you could walk 30, 40, 50 feet out your back door and sometimes just be in this hardwood, old growth forest. And I think I was writing my way probably back to why a lot of these stories were written when I was in Miami in grad school as well. And so it was probably like writing my way, yeah, back to Pontotoc in some ways, like through this fictional town of Bodock.
And as we get to know these characters and their stories, how would you describe these people in this town that you've created that's informed by where you grew up? But it's a fine line between creating three-dimensional characters that might be representative of a time and a place versus drawing them too broadly and then they tip over into something like caricature.
That's a great question. Most fiction writers or anyone who's trying to write about people, whether they're fictional or actual people that a journalist, nonfiction writer, something like that would be writing, is that at the end of it, I mean, this is something that I think is one of like the basics of writing and especially storytelling, is that like every character in the story has to want something. Like there's not a human on the planet like who doesn't have like some sort of desire. And so when you're writing about these characters that inhabit a story or even just a scene within that story, regardless of where they live in the country and what the political landscape is of that particular region, you're thinking about like, what does that character want in this particular scene? What are they trying to do? What are they struggling against? Sometimes it could be a struggle that they've imposed on themselves. Sometimes it could be a struggle that is against external forces. But I think like just if you're trying to write as three-dimensional characters as possible, it's always good to remind yourself that these people want something. And in that sense, they are human and they have their struggles, and all of us are struggling, I guess, in some way. And I think that's how you create, like you're remembering that through those wants, through those desires, like these are supposed to be representative of real people, as opposed to, as you pointed out, potential caricatures, because it is easy to, regardless of like who you're writing about or the region of the country or the world or whatever that you're writing about, it's very easy to create caricatures to exaggerate stereotypes and things like that. And so I think that getting down to like, what does this character want? What are they struggling to get? Who's standing in their way? What's standing in their way? And giving them like meaningful obstacles to either overcome or like the trees in the ice storm to be felled by. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to write caricatures. So that wasn't never the intention. And hopefully that's not what comes out in these stories. These do hopefully feel like real people to the people who are reading them.
Our guest is Robert Busby, author of Bodock Stories, published by Hub City Press.
I'm going to read the opening of the story Fraternal Twins. This is the day before, like the afternoon before the evening when the ice storm would begin. The kernel of this story, the access point, was a story that actually happened to my brother and me. In this story, we're not fraternal twins, but I wanted the characters in this story to be a little bit closer together. And in the story, one of the twins accidentally shoots a mockingbird off of a power line, which is something that I actually did too in front of my brother, like once, completely on accident. I was just trying to like rile him up a little bit and accidentally misaimed and shot the mockingbird down. So that's where this story begins. So this is Fraternal Twins. The afternoon before the ice storm snuck through Bodock, Mississippi, and flung woods to the earth by the acre. The older twin was drawing beads some proximate but safe distance from a mockingbird perched on the power line strung across the yard. No other reason for doing so but to yield a rise out of his too trusting brother. This was Wednesday afternoon, a few hours before the sky ripped open and 5 inches of ice poured out. Bodock Junior High had let out early amid the threat. There was concern in late bus routes, the only thing between the precious cargo and slick roads being drivers ill-accustomed to navigating such. The brothers had rushed home to use the extra time before dinner to continue wearing the new off of a pair of pellet guns. Their X-Men and Batman backpacks nipped like terriers at their legs as they sprinted down Main Street and skated across a Piggly Wiggly parking lot already heaving with the vehicles of weather-panicked shoppers. Behind the grocery store, they ran along the train tracks until they took a narrow four-wheeler trail carved through the previous summer. The trail brought them to the point in their backyard where the emu pen brushed the woods. Their father had referred to the lofty birds as the redneck cousins of ostriches and had invested much money in the fowl for their eggs and steaks. The pen was a chain-link skeleton now. Their father, intoxicated one night in the month after that brief market had collapsed, had freed the emu to fend for themselves. Holstered in the older brother's back pocket was his own pellet gun, a gas-powered revolver instead of the pump-action air rifle he had forcefully borrowed from his brother. The distance between them and the perched mockingbird was too great for the revolver to pose a legitimate threat. They were fraternal twins, and so their resemblance seemed more distant than the jointly occupied womb. The older brother, Nathan, was taller and the more handsome of the two. Nicholas had a larger head and a more sentimental nature. Nathan had already fired twice at the mockingbird, one shot intentionally south of the power line and one impossibly to the left. The bird's song was unaffected by the pellets whispering safely by. Something inside Nicholas's towhead explained his brother's aim as purposefully wild. Further, the mockingbird's gray feathers made for a difficult target, barely decipherable against the clouded backdrop except for the flicking of its white-spotted tail feathers. Still, Nicholas could neither ignore caution nor the gullible thump in his chest. "Nathan, don't," he said. "Don't shoot it, man." "Shut up," Nathan said. "Let me concentrate. It's the state bird. What does Mississippi even need its own bird for? You'll go to hell for it anyway." "Says who?" "Anyone," Nicholas said. "To kill a mockingbird." "You mean how to kill a mockingbird?" And Nicholas tried to edit the smile drawing across his face. When his efforts proved pointless, Nicholas directed his face elsewhere until he had reclaimed his composure. They had just watched To Kill a Mockingbird at school, and Nicholas recalled something about falling out of favor with God for harming a mockingbird or any other innocent bird. Otherwise, he'd been distracted for most of the movie by the lice hopscotching in the sable hair of Lacey Audubon Judon draped in front of him. Nicholas had never before desired to examine the entire surface of someone's body, even and especially those parts covered by swimsuits. The ellipsis of her backbone imprinted in her neck had inspired in Nicholas the sudden impulse to invite Lacey to swim the creek with him so he could long over every square inch of light brown flesh he had inherited from her black father and white mother. And then there was the guilt when, after Lacey was escorted from the class by the school nurse, he had felt relieved he had never once disclosed his infatuation with this half-black girl to anyone. Nathan pumped the lever on the gun several times to deposit power into the rifle before overstating the sight's distance above the bird. Both the rifle and the revolver were Christmas gifts. A month's worth of practice could be assessed in the remnants of plastic Coke bottles and sandcastle molds blown up and scattered across the yard. But those had all been near targets, 20 feet at best. The gun's trajectory at this range was one unfamiliar to Nathan, and he was as surprised as Nicholas when he pulled the trigger and the bird dropped in slow suspension from the power line. Nicholas said, "You killed it." "No, I didn't." "You're going to hell." "It ain't dead," Nathan insisted, but he was quite sure the bird had expired. Then a wing fluttered. Nathan's heart mimicked the gesture. Both brothers waited for the bird to take flight, to soar away in some miracle they had only ever read about in the Bible, Moses parting the Red Sea or the ascent of Elijah, Jesus raising first Lazarus and then himself from the dead. Nathan mouthed a prayer for just such a miracle, but the bird's flight was restricted to some grotesque flopping, a one-legged ballerina pirouetting to the refuge of an oak leaf hydrangea in the middle of the yard.
We're speaking with Robert Busby, author of Bodock Stories, published by Hub City Press. Who are you reading now? In particular, are there any that are from the Southeast?
I just read Caleb Johnson's Treeborn. That was a really fantastic book. I think it was published in 2018, and it's sort of just a sprawling generational tale, like in the vein of Faulkner or Marquez or even like Donald Harrington, who was an Arkansas writer, wrote The Architecture of the Arkansas Ozarks, which was also this sort of like generational tale. This year, I also read someone from, I guess, y'all's neck of the woods, Jamie Quattro, her Two-Step Devil, which was just also like the stream of consciousness in that book that she captures is also, I mean, like, I don't want to keep saying like Faulknerian because there are other writers who do.
It's hard to get away from him.
Especially if you grew up between New Albany and Oxford, like I did, which, you know, he was born in New Albany, basically spent most of his life, obviously, in Oxford. It's hard to get out from under that shadow, but at least in terms of like just the comparisons like get made back. Yeah, so Jamie Quattro. Right now, I'm reading a novel, Free Men by Katie Simpson Smith. I think she lives in maybe New Orleans now, but I think she's from Jackson, Mississippi. I don't try to limit my reading, obviously, to the Southeast, but I do return often to this region and the fiction that comes out of this region. I read Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. I feel like I'm still digesting what she was able, the psychology of these characters that she was able just to capture and articulate. And it's great inspiration. These benchmarks that these fantastic writers in the South are setting and giving the rest of us something to aspire to and to emulate. It's a great time to be a writer alive in the South.
And for people who want to learn more about Hub City Press, which is the publisher of Bodock, they can go to hubcity.org. For people who want to learn more about you, where can they go online?
I have a website, roberthoustonbusby.com. I'm on Instagram, Robert Busby Writes. I have like a bookmark on Twitter, but I'm never on Twitter. Really, it's there. It's Bob Busby Writes, but I'm mainly on Instagram. You can also find me on Facebook, but I'm not on there very much at all either.
All right, Robert, thanks so much.
Thanks, Ray.